That helpful?
Yeah.
Thank you. So, NHGS is for 3 programs, and we do a few other projects, but these are kind of the core programs. The flood hazards program, which stream crossings falls under, and then the other 2 are the groundwater monitoring network. Mike Howley is the lead for that program, and basically there's a network of groundwater monitoring wells throughout the state, both bedrock and overburden wells, and the aim for that program is to get it's satellite telemetry data, so there's continuous measurements at most of these wells, and it's a really good drought indicator. So in contrast to flood hazards, which is too much water on the landscape, groundwater monitoring network is geared towards looking at when there's drought conditions, not enough water. And then the other core program at the survey is geologic mapping, which Josh Keeley is the lead for that program. Basically, that's it's funded through USGS in a program called State Map, and NHGS contracts out geologic mappers who are usually sort of retired professors most of the time, and they will do some superficial or bedrock geologic mapping in a certain region of the state, and then we take that data and produce a full product for that map, and that helps to inform certain decisions for private industry or other environmentally sort of an environmental lens for making decisions. So that's kind of the core 3 programs that New Hampshire Geological Survey hosts. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking about stream crossings. I think most of you are probably familiar with the concept of stream crossings, but just to make sure, a stream crossing is a structure such as a culvert or bridge where a road, railroad, or trail crosses over some type of water body. So it could be a stream, river, lake, or wetland. And you can see some good examples in the photos there. It could either be a box culvert or bridge, or you'll see a lot of circular pipe culverts, but they come in lots of shapes and sizes. So why do we care about stream crossings? Because I think a lot of maybe people who are a little bit more natural resource minded will realize their importance on the landscape, but I think a lot of people kind of overlook culverts, and it's something that you just kind of pass by every day on your way to work, and it's easy to overlook them, but they're really critical points within the landscape. And I kind of like to imagine them as pinch points within the watershed. So you have the natural stream width that's going to this point on the road, and then it has to cross the road. And a lot of the time you have to shrink down that stream width, and it's transforming the channel of the stream or wetland or water body. And basically, when you do that, you're creating a point that's prone to washouts and failure if you get heavy precipitation events all in a short period of time. So you can see a pretty good example on the right here of what happens when you might have an undersized culvert or a culvert that's misaligned to the stream. And it's a pretty common situation when you have these heavy rain events that the culvert might wash out, and it often results in damage on the surrounding infrastructure and in in sort of a worst case scenario, it can cut off emergency services. Obviously, that road on the bottom right there is completely impassable. So if you have a single road or a single community leading, or a single road leading to a community, emergency services can't get through there, and it could threaten life. So that's kind of why NHGS cares about stream crossings for the flood risk and public safety element, but other organizations might care about culverts for the stream connectivity, habitat connectivity, and wildlife passage element. So basically what happens, as I sort of alluded to, you have the pinch point, or I like to imagine it as a fire hose effect, where you have a smaller culvert than should be in that stream channel, and it speeds up the velocity through the conduit. And when that happens, you'll often get this sort of down cutting at the outlet of the culvert, and it starts to accumulate, or it starts to gradually take away sediment at the outlet of the culvert, and eventually you might get something like the photo on the bottom there, where the culvert is perched above the natural stream bed. And when that happens, that can cut off populations of sensitive species like brook trout or Blanding's turtles. So you might have these isolated populations, and they can't access, if they're migratory especially, they can't access valuable habitat upstream, and they might it might reduce genetic diversity for those populations, and it's just kind of a bad situation for aquatic and terrestrial life. So a good a well-designed stream crossing would support watershed connectivity and improve ecosystem health.
You may not be able to, sorry, do you mind if I?
Yeah, no, yeah, sorry, question.
Just curious about that bottom picture there. What, like, can you give a sense to what the scale of the erosion might be and the timeline that might have occurred there? Because I feel like that's a pretty common site, and I've never really thought too closely about how that erosion, how fast it might happen, or I guess the impacts you're discussing.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's probably a case by case basis, but I think in those extreme events, like I was talking about, like you might have some gradual erosion there over time with that kind of flow, but I think it's kind of in fits and starts, where if you have a really high intensity rainfall event, then you might wash away a lot of sediment all at once. So yeah, it kind of depends, and it's possible that that particular site, that might not be good habitat anyway for fish, but there are a lot of situations, like I don't know if that's just a drainage crossing or what, but yeah, it's a pretty common site where it's really obvious that you're having that constant down cutting of the stream bed, and it's clearly like perched 4 feet above the natural stream bed. Yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned, sort of a natural or a well-designed culvert would, I think, sort of be invisible for wildlife upon the landscape. So you might have a natural bottom rather than a pipe culvert. So that's really important for wildlife, but it's also important to have a well-designed crossing that doesn't disrupt the natural river processes. So when you do have an incompatible culvert that either is undersized for that given stream, or it might be misaligned to the stream channel, you would get this erosion. It's just another gradual process that's happening continuously as water tends to do. But you'll have erosion and scour and sedimentation, all of these geomorphological processes that are damaging the surrounding infrastructure. It could lead to unstable banks. When you have the sedimentation, it increases the total sediment in the water, which degrades the water quality. So it has kind of, when a culvert's designed in a way that doesn't fit the natural processes of the river or stream, then you have these kind of detrimental effects. And then kind of the last element that is considered when we're looking at stream crossings and why we should care about them, I think is just the general infrastructure condition and the condition as it relates to the roadways that they're crossing under. So a lot of these structures were, as many of you probably know, built a long time ago, decades ago, and they've kind of reached the end of their lifespan in a lot of cases. And when that happens, you might get rust, taking out the bottom of a steel corrugated culvert, or you might get blocks of a concrete box culvert falling off. And so that continuous deterioration has a lot of detrimental effects to not just the roadway potentially, but also the stream channel, and can increase the chances of flooding as well. All right, so I thought it would be good to kind of give a few examples that have happened in this particular event in Alstead. I'm sure a lot of you are aware, being it being sort of local to the area, but this event in Alstead in October of 2005 was kind of the catalyst for why there was a closer look and a broad effort to examine stream crossings across the state. And I thought, instead of me trying to explain it, there was a WMUR segment a few years back, basically remembering the Alstead. Apologies for the laugh.
I had lunch with him today.
So I think that sort of speaks for itself. it's kind of a worst case scenario of what happens when a culvert fails. And it wasn't just a one-off situation. Over the last 20 years, there have been plenty of examples of these culverts failing. It was kind of that was sort of the justification for taking a closer look and trying to establish a more systematic approach to examining these culverts and assessing them, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. But the very next year, there were the Mother's Day floods of 2006, widespread flooding throughout the state. So here's just an example of the Chelsea Hill Road Bridge, which was overwhelmed in Rochester. And then the very next year, the Patriots Day floods in April of 2007. Here's an example of a failed culvert on Topaz Drive in Barrington. And that particular site was, as I sort of mentioned earlier, it was a case where that road being washed out, cut off, it isolated a residential community of about 100 homes for 3 days. So it was another sort of dire situation from a public safety standpoint. But for that particular culvert, they did the emergency repairs, and then I guess it was years later, it was identified by the Nature Conservancy as a critical fish passage barrier as well. So it ended up being sort of a win-win scenario to replace it. And it took a while, but I think it was last year that they upgraded the crossing, and now it's a nice bridge with natural bottom, and it's much more resilient to flooding, hopefully now, and also allowed for fish passage and had a wildlife shelf and everything. So it's a good example of an improved site. And then more locally, there was some flooding in Winchester back in July of 2014. These are a couple pictures of road washouts on Old Westport Road. And I think in that particular situation, there was parts of the community that were cut off as well. So that was another situation where they were trying to get these roads back up and running as quickly as possible. And then in July 2021, getting more recent, Ackworth up in Upper Valley was hit pretty hard. There were 32 road washouts that year in July 2021. And I know Cranebrook Road was one of the more major ones, obviously, a pretty extensive amount of damage there at that culvert. And then in July 2023, I was around to experience just kind of the constant rain last summer all throughout the state. And I thought that was a pretty good representation, a good visual for how much rain we were getting both in 2021 and in 2023. So this is at Otterbrook Lake. The green line represents the 2023 precipitation. It's an accumulated precipitation graph. So each spike represents a rainfall event. And so there was both in the green 2023 and the blue 2021, you can see that it was just sort of constant rain throughout the summer. And each time that happens, when there's not really a reprieve from the rain, you have saturated soils, and that allows for more overland flow, which can more easily overwhelm the roads and culverts, which is exactly what happened in a lot of parts of the state. So at least from NHGS's perspective, and since I've been in this role, there's been a sort of focus on Southwest New Hampshire because of these events that have occurred over the years. And I think one of the things that it's due in part to the topography in this region of the state, and it's slightly different than other parts of the state, but it's kind of dubbed as flashier watersheds, which just means those Yeah. Basically, when there's steep terrain in the headwaters, the streams can rise really quickly and have downstream effects and basically do exactly what was seen in those examples and quickly wash out culverts or roadways. So I think everyone is aware of the Vermont flooding last year as well. And I think this region of the state sort of has similar topography to Vermont, where you have those hills and valleys and free flowing water. And I think that's contributed to a lot of the flooding issues in that region, in this region.
That's a good question about that.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not like an expert in this area at all, but I've heard people say that like the FEMA flood maps don't correlate with the actual flooding that we have here. Can you explain that? Is that true? And, yeah, I guess I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I know, just from calls, there's a working group that we're a part of, and FEMA is part of that. I am not super familiar with their maps either.
Well, I can tell you because I just had a meeting with the FEMA people.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know, maybe 3 months ago. And for Alstead, which you also had all that damage in 2005. If you look at that map, the bottom half of Alstead, which is part of the watershed for the Hauschild River, the FEMA maps have now been all brought up to current as far as, because Southwest did an incredible job doing the mapping of the Hauschild River basin, if you will. So the maps in the bottom half of Alstead are now all up to speed with regards to FEMA, but the top half, where the flood occurred, we're still waiting for FEMA to come back and update those maps, because they still have that, you know, how in the beginning of that, they said the Cooper Hill Road culvert started the whole mess. They still have that culvert, is like, we rebuilt it. We never rebuilt it. We said, no, we're never putting that back there again. Cooper Hill Road is now a dead end.
Yeah.
We didn't put it back. And so the water, what happened in 2005 literally can't happen again, because now that's this huge area where all this water can flow and a whole bunch more before anything bad happens. But, you know, upstream from that and downstream from that, they've never come back to map it out. So I would say that right now, it's true that FEMA is completely overwhelmed with what's going on across the country with disasters, and they just simply can't catch up. They don't have the manpower or the resources to catch up. And that's not a problem with FEMA, that's a problem with our US Congress. They're not giving them the money to do it. And so I think that's where that stands, and that's why so many towns right now, their maps are old and they're not being updated, and FEMA just doesn't have the resources because they're too busy fighting the floods. Look at what they have to do in North Carolina right now. I mean, they can't be out here mapping when they have all this damage in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess my question was more about like, and this is mostly anecdotal, but like in the city of Keene, we have maps that show where flooding actually occurred in these large flood events, and that doesn't necessarily coincide with where the floodplain is in
Yeah.
Keene. And so I'm just curious about that discrepancy.
Yeah, when I talked to the people 3 months ago, they said, we're well aware that we're way behind.
But it's not even, there's like areas that were in the floodplain that didn't flood at the
Yeah.
same time, the other areas that were out of the floodplain
And
did
did
flood.
And
And
they need
so
to
it's-
be changed.
All of our regulations are tied to the FEMA flood maps.
Right,
That-
right.
Yeah, so I'm just curious.
Including your flood insurance and all of that.
Yeah, I can maybe try to get back to you, because I know it's called Risk Map, and they've been gradually updating by, I don't know what size watershed, but I know they've done parts of the Merrimack and Kentucky, and updated those. But yeah, I don't know how well it coincides with, I think they've been trying to get local feedback, so hopefully it aligns better in the future, but yeah, I'm not super tuned into their
Yeah,
progress.
they did say that because Southwest region did such a wonderful job on the Hauschild Valley, Hauschild River watershed, that they were able to update all of their maps that connected to that. They looked at what these folks had done and they said, this is perfect. We can update these maps, but nothing else got mapped. So if the Hauschild doesn't go through your town, and it does in Keene's case, you know, they don't know what you got.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so with all of that in mind, and the Halstead flood, the Mother's Day floods, Patriots Day floods, that was kind of the reasoning behind the formation of the New Hampshire Stream Crossing Initiative. And from NHGS and the Flood Hazards Program perspective, and so the current state geologist, Shane Chicky, was kind of the administrator of that program early on. And the goal was to try to more closely examine these culverts throughout the state and what happens to them during heavy sustained precipitation and what kind of condition they're in to deal with potential flooding. So that was the NHGS perspective, but as I mentioned, there's other perspectives surrounding culverts. So groups like Fish and Game or the Nature Conservancy or Trout Unlimited were more interested in identifying barriers to fish. So they came on to the Stream Crossing Initiative early on as well. And I know TNC was doing surveys in the Ashuelot in 2006 or so. So there was kind of precedent for the survey work that they were doing on culverts. And then lastly, from a more structural condition infrastructure perspective, DOT came on board to the initiative, and also groups like just basically municipalities and their asset management teams or infrastructure maintenance teams were also interested in developing some sort of more systematic database to track culvert condition.
Can I say one last thing about that picture that you have up on the screen?
Sure, yeah.
Right now, if you look closely, to the left there, you'll see this second culvert that's like, there's no water running through it at all. That's exactly for what Brian is saying. When the water gets up high, there's now a second way for the water to get through. And that's, we've built a bunch of those in Alstead where the water doesn't run through them unless we're in the middle of one of these.
Yeah.
In 2021 it did, 2023 it did, but it hasn't run through there since because it's a good way. That's a second way to get water through there rather than lose the road when the water gets up as high as the top of that bridge.
How unique is that?
Yeah, it's pretty common. That's
They're
actually,
building them all the time now.
that's actually one of the, and I'll talk about it a little more for the protocol and the data collection side of things, but one of the data pieces that we collect are overflow pipes. So if there's an overflow pipe or not, and yeah, I think it is pretty important.
Sink.
Yeah, exactly.
I would think children would have a really good time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when there's no water in there.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, this stream crossing initiative that was formed consisted of experts in fish biology, geomorphology, transportation, flood risk, aquatic ecology, and many more disciplines. And I think the original intent was to get as much feedback as possible about what people valued in these culvert points and basically how we could most efficiently go out there and evaluate culverts for flood risk, but also aquatic organism passage and structure conditions. So eventually it ended with the incorporation of the statewide asset data exchange system, which is abbreviated SADES. And that was basically the vehicle for collecting and storing the data in a sort of live layer manner. So that data is hosted by the UNH Technology Transfer Center, and then all those other groups are also involved with a lot of contributions from other entities as well. So as I was kind of talking about with the protocol and the attributes that are collected, this was developed and it's gone through a few different iterations over the last 15 years or so. And the goal was to put together, since there were different protocols at the time floating around out there, but they were either just geared towards structure condition or if there were fish barriers. So the goal of this sort of synthesized protocol was to incorporate parameters related to AOP, aquatic organism passage, and geomorphology and structure condition, et cetera, so that it made data collection more efficient. So if you have if you're paying a survey team to be out there, then they can collect data that's useful to a variety of stakeholders all at once. So it's now collected in survey teams of 2 on iPads in an app called ArcGIS Field Maps, which is pretty intuitive to use. You just go through the protocol with drop-down menus and input the data. So over the years, the Stream Crossing Initiative has hosted stream crossing assessment trainings at the beginning of each field season. It's usually in late May that we'll hold a full day webinar with basically the underlying principles behind either the geomorphology or aquatic ecology and all the data that's being collected. And then we'll do a half-day field session in Franklin, and that usually we'll usually get about 40 to 50 people in attendance. So there's kind of a broad network of groups that end up attending these. So a little bit more about the data collection. So that protocol, the standardized protocol, is currently comprised of about 80 quantitative and qualitative attributes at each stream crossing. And after the data is collected, it undergoes a fairly rigorous QA/QC process to ensure that it's really high quality data. And that's done using the standardized photos, which are taken at each site. And I think the photos are actually just kind of separately another important piece to the data collection. And I think being able to see what that culvert looks like without having to go out there is a useful tool for a lot of groups. So just to kind of give a better sense of the survey parameters that we're taking. So I won't go through all 80 parameters, but generally you're looking at water depth at various points within the channel, structure dimensions, bank full widths, the condition of the culvert, if it's good, fair, or poor, and then other geomorphology related parameters like the angle of the stream flow approach, etc. All right, so that data has been, there's been ongoing collection for the last 15 years or so, probably 10 years in full. So as of this month, there have been 16,455 crossings assessed throughout the state, which is about 79% of the predicted crossings. So it's been a pretty monumental effort for data collection. And I think a pretty rare data set when you compare to other states and their culvert inventories statewide. But basically what's left at this point is about 4,000 crossings, mostly in the western side of the state and some with some missing data. So yeah, it's a pretty good percentage of the state that's been visited and surveyed for culvert condition and everything else that I talked about.
When you say unassessed, because I know there are in several cases, maybe a pretty common thing to run into is you'll find culverts that maybe the town didn't know about or DES didn't know about. So are those 4,000 like predicted crossings that are there, or that you know for sure exist?
Yeah, that's just predicted, and it is constantly being updated with new information. It's basically the way that that was determined where those unassessed sites are was basically by intersecting the National Wetlands Inventory, which includes streams with roads, railroads, OHRV trails, and basically anywhere where you would expect to find a crossing. But yeah, some of those.
Sorry, what's the difference between the unassessed and missing data on that?
Yeah, so the missing data, those have been visited to some extent, but for some reason or another, there wasn't, there should have been more data collected at that particular site, but there wasn't for a variety of reasons, so it kind of indicates
Partially of
that,
that.
yeah,
Okay.
so it would be best if it was revisited and completed.
So based on that comment you made, this isn't necessarily just public roads, because you alluded to, like say like a state park or something, would those be included?
A state park.
They're not public roads, but there are culverts. I'm
Yeah.
just curious. I do a lot
Yeah,
of-
we filter out any private roads, so it should just be on public roads.
Okay.
I
They're not
guess,
private because it's a state park, but
yeah,
it wouldn't be public roads.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
and those are generally marked, so they might be in the map, and I know the DOT roads GIS layer has private roads marked as a category on their maps, so there are some in the database that are basically assessed or marked as complete, but they're on private roads. So, yeah, there's no data there since it's private, but it's there.
Is there any kind of, a lot of this data was collected through private initiatives and a coalition of efforts, but is there funding for any government program to wrap up this thing with another 20%?
There is definitely efforts. I think that was kind of an original goal of the project, was to finish the state for culvert assessments. And I'll kind of get into it a little bit more later, but I think there's kind of a push to, now that we have a decent majority of the state covered, I think there's a bit more of a push to focus more towards prioritizing which culverts should be replaced now that we have this pretty decent chunk of the state. But there is always ongoing assessments, and there's probably about 1,500 assessed just this past year. Like, we had a couple interns, there was a couple of private institutions that were conducting assessments, mostly up in the North Country. So it's kind of an ongoing process, but
Yeah. And I'm guessing you share the data with the towns or the highway departments so that they're aware that they have a high risk culvert, or gee, your culvert looks great,
yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah, and I have a slide that shows where this data is publicly available, but I think trying to strengthen the connection between us having this data and the towns being able to access it is one of the goals for a couple of the projects that are ongoing, just because, I mean, it's all publicly available, but we want to make sure
But everybody knows it's there.
truly access it, or even is aware that it exists.
Right.
Yeah, so that's been enough. Yeah.
I've had a burning question. I'm so happy that I can ask it. There was a box culvert recently, put in Middle Road in Hancock. And I've been trying to find out, the protocol, and so I'm listening. And the politics of it all, someone, Mead Caddo at the Harris Center for Conservation Education in Hancock. So it's a road that I drive I go to the Harris Center a lot. And for 6 weeks, I couldn't take that short road. I had to go around because of this big cement box culvert on a stream. And the stream itself, it's a flat area, oxbows. The watershed, it doesn't seem to be a flashy location. So that, and then I have a friend who grumbles about, oh, it's American Recovery Act. They're just throwing money at, that's what a waste. And so I want to know that it's not a waste and that there is a protocol. And Mead at the Harris Center had said something about it was identified as a significant wildlife passage. And I don't know what kind of, there was an article in the paper that mentioned turtles. So I really don't know. I've heard things. So to my eye, again, I drive, I don't see any swish turtles because the turtle population has declined so much, but it's not a roadkill area that I'm aware of. But what would that be? Beavers, otters, turtles. I don't think it's a big night, first rainy day in April. I don't think it's, the Harris Center actually blocks off and has stream volunteers that help the amphibians across. It's not that area. So I'm curious there wasn't a washout. There was a different stream that washed out 8 years ago. And I'm definitely gonna, next time I drive, I'm gonna get out and look at what the culvert replacement was. I'm curious now. But so I don't expect you to know about this culvert on Middle Road in Hancock, but I hope you do.
Potentially, because I can't remember his name, but I think was a gentleman at our Geologic Mappers workshop earlier this year who mentioned Middle Road specifically, and that there's been work done on certain culverts. So I think I might know which culvert you're talking about. But yeah, it's hard to say what the plans are. I'm not sure.
Well, it's in, it's done.
Okay, yeah.
And I looked at the construction and it was kind of interesting. A
Yeah.
bunch of pressure treated. It was, well, I'm not gonna get into that. But it's mostly the protocol.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to say to my fellow who gripes about American recovery funding being thrown at paving roads that were fine,
Mhm.
didn't need it. So,
Yeah.
how can I find out the process? Oh, and also, while I think of it, I got out, I have a grandson who likes to fish, so he disappeared downstream. And I could walk under, the culvert and it's riprap, really like, and I thought, no turtle's gonna walk across this. And so that turtles, passage of turtles, I'm not that familiar with turtles other than females in June coming up and laying their eggs. I don't know what they do. Anyway, riprap, is not hospitable to critters.
Yeah.
Walking, and it was pretty universally. There was a little bit of grass over on one side, so that would be a question about engineering.
Yeah.
If wildlife passages, which of course it is, that's the whole.
Yeah.
That and floods.
Yeah, and I know wildlife shelves are becoming they're usually considered with the replacement of a lot of these culverts. So you have up above the natural stream channel, you have wildlife shelves. But yeah, I've noticed it's sometimes a little bit rip-rappy, and I'm not sure.
This was
I'm not a turtle
very
expert,
big. Yeah,
but I don't know what kind of.
I do, I want to look into it.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'd be curious.
It's politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know who would I.
Yeah, I guess probably Fish and Game would have the best data, and I know they do. They have a data set of turtle, especially state endangered species of turtles.
Yeah.
Basically observations, or they have this wildlife action plan layer.
Sure. Yeah,
Sure.
I want to know why this particular, culvert, again, there was no washout, so it was selected as a top priority.
Yeah.
And so I want information that, convincing information why that was a priority, because they're, very expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very obvious.
Yeah, I'd be curious to look into that as well, because, yeah, I'm not totally sure.
Do you know if the state red listed it or anything, if the Department of Transportation red listed the old one, so it had to be replaced?
I travel the road a lot. I've never seen an issue.
Well, I mean, if the town would know.
Yeah.
Why they replaced it, because I'm sure the town had to pay at least part of the
Yeah.
money to replace it.
Yeah.
So you should ask the selectmen or something to look
Yeah.
up in the, or maybe it's in your old town report for whatever year they did it. They may say why.
Yeah,
I know in our case in Alsted, the only ones we ever replace are the ones that the state says, if you don't replace this soon, we're gonna shut the road down.
it's a fail. I'm sure there's a,
Yeah, they
Yeah.
call them red listing and that's.
I know people on the Conservation Commission. I'll start there.
So, yeah, a lot of progress. Man.
I guess another question, are, the corrugated, the round, are replacements, I would think it'd be cost prohibitive to, again, this is not a flashpoint
Mhm.
to my eye. Are, the old round, culverts being, I think they'd be sunk, right, so that you don't want them high and dry.
Yeah,
But so some culverts are being replaced, culverts being placed with things other than box.
I think, well, yeah, when they're replaced in kind, and I think there's the culvert maintainer program.
Yeah.
So anything under 4 feet can be replaced in kind, so they might they might not be replacing it with a natural bottom box culvert, but just another pipe,
Yeah.
because that might be more affordable. But yeah, hopefully the design would be level with the stream
Yeah,
bottom.
and Peterborough is very aware of culverts and, 100-year floods,
Mhm.
whatever that's the goal to
Yeah.
meet whatever that, it's been changed somewhat,
Yeah,
given the reality.
right, yeah, increasing precipitation, yeah. So just to kind of highlight the recent work that's been done in Southwest New Hampshire. So we've worked with Southwest Regional Planning Commission for the past couple of years that I've been here, to conduct culvert surveys throughout the region. So SWRPC is in red, so they've been in Westmoreland, Harrisville, and then NHGS has had 6 interns in the field over the past couple of years conducting culvert surveys sort of throughout the region. And UNH also hired some interns and they sort of snuck into the southeast corner of the region. So just to kind of highlight the work and the focus that's been done recently.
I can't read the scale on that, but what are you looking at there, the color wise? So all those gold ones, for example, looks like, what are they?
All the what ones?
They look like gold, yellow.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, I mean, I'm looking at, all right, looking at Chesterfield, there's a whole cluster of them. What are the color?
Oh, sorry,
ones?
yeah.
I can't read the legend.
Yeah, the legend's a little small.
NHGS, the Geological Survey.
So each of those gold orange points is where NHGS completed the
Okay.
culvert assessment.
Okay, thank you.
That the red is.
Did they not let you into Walpole or something?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. Yeah, there was kind of a watershed boundary that we were
I see.
focused on, yeah.
The other side of the hill.
So, just to kind of reiterate the broad base of organizations that have been involved in the Stream Crossing Initiative throughout the years. obviously the state agencies like DES or Fish and Game, DOT, but the regional planning commissions throughout the state have been really instrumental in the work. And then there's also been nonprofit organizations like you mentioned Harris Center, Trout Unlimited, and also some consulting, engineering consultants that have been involved as well. So I think it's a really desirable program to get involved with, just because everyone can see the benefits in a lot of ways.
And you said that this information is publicly available?
Yep, yeah, I might have a slide coming up. Not sure if it's the next one.
It's not a lot in Marlboro.
So once the stream crossing assessments have been done, it's been reviewed by the review team at NHGS. Then the goal is to score it for these 4 elements that I kind of talked about at the top of the presentation. So there's a score for geomorphic compatibility, which is essentially trying to gauge how well that culvert fits within the stream channel. So it ranges from fully compatible to fully incompatible. And then there's the aquatic organism passage, which is a little bit more intuitive. So if you have basically, like I was saying, an invisible culvert, natural bottom, no outlet drop, then it would be full passage for aquatic organisms, but a lot of them are reduced passage or no passage when you have those big outlet drops. And then hydraulic capacity is trying to capture the flood risk for that particular culvert. So I think everyone is aware of the certain storm intervals that you could have. So a 2-year storm up to a 100-year storm, or even greater than that. So for each of those storm intervals, we model if those floodwaters will pass through the culvert, or if they'll be vulnerable to overtopping, which you can see in yellow. And that means that the simulated floodwaters at that storm interval would be somewhere between the top of the culvert and the top of the road. And then you could also have an overtop category, which means that the modeled floodwaters would be at or above the road. Yeah.
Is there any work being done to redo those 100-year designations? I mean,
Yeah.
they now come every 10 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's kind of a mandate, at least for the coastal program, and they've been working to try to reconsider because it's trying to take normal precipitation into account, but there's not really a normal precipitation level at this point. So it could be just adding 15% to those levels, or maybe some more advanced metrics trying to take different standards into consideration. Yeah, that's,
Heavy downpours that are becoming more normal,
yeah,
you know, are going to have a whole different effect.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and there's the sort of weather whiplash where you might have dry conditions for a while and then a ton of rain all at once. It's not really
Right.
consistent rain. So yeah, I think that is something that's being considered, trying to adjust the normal levels of storm events. And then lastly, structural condition, which is just a qualitative good, fair, or poor from the survey teams. So we score all of these, and then next slide. So yeah, there were a couple questions about where the data is available. It's available on this mapping tool called the Aquatic Restoration Mapper. So once it's collected, reviewed, and scored, it becomes available as a live layer on this Aquatic Restoration Mapper, which is an online mapping tool that's designed to explore the stream crossing data throughout the state. this is just a screenshot of the guide document. And I guess there's probably not time to do a demo, but, this is a pretty good little guide document for exploring and using the layers and tools. But essentially its intent is to help identify candidates for culvert and bridge replacement to improve aquatic connectivity, infrastructure safety, and flood resilience. And you can find that by, I think if you just type in New Hampshire aquatic restoration mapper, there's probably a link in Google, or you can go to the Stream Crossing Initiative website and navigate to that mapper.
Is that initiative the DES? Or is it DOT, or is it a?
It's sort of a joint effort. I would say DES is kind of it's a pretty equal effort because the chair of the steering committee is from the Environment Bureau at DOT, but it's kind of a joint effort between state agencies.
Sorry, I have to.
No worries. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I would say we should plan not to do a demo now, and if we have time at the end, we can fire it up and see, but I just want to make sure we have time for questions.
Yeah. So as I had mentioned a little earlier, in regard to your question about finishing the state, I think the overall view now is with 79% of the state surveyed. That's a lot more environmental data than other programs generally have. So I think it's a good time to sort of start transitioning and shifting the efforts towards replacement prioritization and connecting the data with municipalities so that they can pursue funding opportunities to actually get these culverts replaced. And just as a good example of that process at play, this was the Millbrook crossing at Portsmouth Street in Concord. And in 2016, it was identified as a priority to get replaced. You can see on the left, it doesn't look like a great crossing, prone to flooding and not great for organism passage. So in 2019, they ended up replacing that 42-inch pipe with a 16-foot natural bottom culvert, which you can see on the right. And that was partially funded using aquatic resources mitigation funding to reconnect floodplain wetlands. And I think that was a good project where you had multi-benefit outcomes as a result of the replacement.
Are there still plans to try and cover the remaining 20%? You know, when we have towns like Walpole that have, it looks like none of their culverts assessed. What's the strategy?
Definitely. Well, my colleague is better at pursuing funding opportunities, and she's been looking at ways or avenues that we could continue the assessment work in the places that haven't been served. So I think there are goals to try to complete that assessment work simultaneously with trying to prioritize replacements for.
That's the same point I was trying to get at earlier, that
Yeah,
a bridge, and we had one red dot there, and that was a bridge that was redlined, and we had to replace it, but it took 10 years to figure that out.
yeah,
But in terms of assessment, there's none. And when you say that now that you got 79% data, you're gonna prioritize. Well, you're prioritizing the data that you have.
Mhm.
And the data you don't have, there could be just as critical situations out there.
Yeah, that's very true.
So I think that should be an incentive to finish the percentage to get to 100 or close to it.
Yeah,
And that's prior to prioritizing.
Mhm.
Because then you know what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to do what you can as it comes along, of course, but.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you there. And that's, there's a couple, I think I might have it on the next slide. There's basically this was a pretty major project that we've sort of dubbed the UNH ARPA project. So you mentioned American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. This was a grant program that was administered by UNH but managed by the coastal program at DES. And their goal was to finish those two watersheds. And so they ended up surveying 4,000 crossings in the last 2 years. And there were pretty significant efforts with them hiring 12 interns to go out and collect data in each of those 2 years. But now those two watersheds in the southeastern part of the state are fully done for culvert assessments. So to your point, now that they have the full data set complete, they can better prioritize what actually needs to be done on a watershed scale. So yeah, that is the ideal scenario of getting all the data that you have across the landscape and then prioritizing. So yeah, kind of to continue off of that, at this point, in the process for that project, they've been collaborating with stakeholders and experts, trying to gather feedback about their priorities. So not just for what we're scoring in SAIDs, but also other factors that people might value in terms of culvert replacements. So there's a gentleman named Karash who's a PhD candidate at UNH, and he's trying to build a multi-objective optimization model for stream crossings in those two watersheds to really rank which culverts are the most desirable to replace and would have the most widespread benefit for all of these different factors, while also taking into consideration the cost, because that's kind of the driving factor in a lot of cases. And then NHGS, there's a sort of parallel program. NHGS was awarded a grant from EPA to continue the transition of the management and ownership of stream crossing data to municipalities. And we are working with Southwest Regional Planning Commission, as well as UNHT squared, to be able to provide technical assistance to two pilot communities, which are Winchester and Marlborough. So basically the desired outcome for that project would be a few different things, but we'd hopefully have a flood planning tool to help towns and organizations visualize and analyze the flood risk on a watershed scale. So again, that was actually, next slide might have more information about these project goals. So the original, or the primary goal this past summer was to complete the culvert assessments in the watersheds that intersect both of those two pilot towns. And that was completed. We've finished those culvert assessments. And now the goal is to analyze the wetland conditions and erosion concerns surrounding those crossings, to be able to prioritize, similar to that UNH ARPA project. And I think part of the goal here is to collaborate with municipalities, because obviously they're the ones with the intimate local knowledge of the culvert conditions. And then one of the other ideas with this project was to create a streamlined protocol so that with the maintenance and upkeep of the data, whether it be road agents or anyone managing these assets, they're not having to collect 80 plus parameters at the crossing, because that might not be necessary for continued monitoring moving forward. So we're hoping to create a streamlined protocol that's easier for town officials to continue collecting data and maintain their asset databases.
So you pretty much work with like the town selectmen or whatever the ruling body, governing body is?
Yeah, we have sort of planned meetings, and Shane Chickey, who's the state geologist, has met with town officials at Marlborough and Winchester to kind of figure out where they're at in terms of asset management and their culvert databases and the need moving forward. So yeah, working with selectmen I think, just continuing to get feedback and, collaborate with the towns is kind of where we're headed for that.
Conservation commissions as well, or just mostly from these town officials?
I think, well, yeah, I guess the Regional Planning Commission would probably have better knowledge of the
They're
best avenues,
They're
so.
working with the Conservation Commission in Marlboro, I can tell you.
Oh, okay, that answers that one.
I don't know if they're talking with the road agent, maybe, that might be part of the plan.
Yeah, and we've sort of finished up the first phase of the project, which was finishing the culvert assessments. And so I think, especially starting in 2025 is when we'll start implementing feedback from the municipalities and having more meetings. So the goal is to have meetings before the end of the year with both Marlboro and Winchester to get their feedback. So
Meetings with like the selectmen or like a public hearing?
maybe.
Yeah, I can start to answer that. We're gonna be participating and facilitating the meetings, Mark. And I think the exact composition of who's gonna participate isn't set in stone. I think from one part of this is understanding what the town has to collect into the future. So we'll wanna have like the road agent represented, and kind of the more of a budgeting, financial perspective, but I think there's room for others. And,
I'm just curious, our Conservation Commission has not been very active the last couple of years. So I can understand if town of Marlboro didn't like flag this, but it seems like we could have at least sent out an invitation to be part of this discussion.
yeah, it hasn't been set yet. So I mean, there's still time for them to participate and join. So.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good information because I think the timing would work out to get everyone who wants to be on board with how they want to proceed for this.
Are there designs all set to go that you could say, oh, this place needs, this crossing needs this design? I'm trying to minimize costs,
Yeah.
instead of having some engineer to reinvent the
Yeah,
wheel.
that's a good question. There
A
are.
helicopter coming in and dropping a
Yeah. that would be
99 ton.
I know, I think it's the Wetlands Bureau has more sort of jurisdiction over best practices for culvert replacements. And I think there are some sort of base standards for how to create a resilient crossing. But yeah,
I
as
know
far as I know, it's
I
usually
know everyone's
an
different.
engineer.
It's gotta be, everyone's different, but just,
Yeah, I think that would be a good point to work towards, is trying to minimize the design costs as much as possible. But yeah, I'm not an expert in that kind of stuff, so I'm not sure exactly what is possible there. But yeah, just kind of finishing up here, the overarching goal is to help, now that we have all this data, high quality stream crossing data covering most of the state, the goal is to inform state, regional, and local decision making. So kind of like you were saying, how can they best pursue certain grant opportunities and minimize the cost, but also increase the resilience and prioritize culverts that are in most need of replacement that would have the most widespread benefit. That's kind of the ultimate goal. And then, yeah, the hope is that municipalities and RPCs can manage these decisions about their culverts and have a robust database make those informed decisions with this data in hand. Because a lot of the grant opportunities often have requirements for certain data, and I think being able to say that this culvert replacement would be huge for allowing aquatic organisms to pass through, and it would increase flood resilience, and for like a 100-year storm event, then you're much more likely to maybe get those funding opportunities secured. So that's kind of the overall goal, and that's been the goal of the stream crossing initiative. So thank you for allowing me to talk about the program. Hopefully it's been informative, and yeah, check out the aquatic restoration mapper and stay tuned for more as we continue this project. And I know Southwest Regional Planning Commission has their transportation vulnerability assessment tool as well, and that's sort of, I think that will complement the other work that's being done really well and provide a lot of information to stakeholders.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah,
Thanks very
thank you.
Yeah, that, you mentioned our vulnerability assessment project. I think I mentioned that to the group, probably like 3 meetings ago at this point, but Henry and I have been working on, a project to take all of our region's stream crossings and bridges and, using a Federal Highway Administration model that basically you input the stream crossings and the bridges, and you can feed the model data using stream crossing assessment information, national bridge inventory information, information about the surrounding environment, and stuff like the overall slopes of the watershed that the asset is in, or what does the road look like? What's its functional class? Has the bridge been flagged as a red list bridge, et and the model will help us identify which assets in our region are most vulnerable to flooding events. And we're still working on that project, but hoping to wrap up in the coming months. And Henry, if I missed anything there.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
It's one of these kind of, the question is, now that there's a good amount of data, how do we make the most use of it? And will be one way to score, one crossing against each other, help us make decisions about 10-year plan, things like that.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, and one thing that our road agent has done, he's been on the job since 2016, I believe. He's also tracking how many times we had to replace this culvert because it got washed out and things like that, and how much bigger this culvert is from when they started. And he's mapped out probably, I would say close to 200 culverts in Alstead, going into various roads. And it's basically every one that since 2016, he's had to do some work on. And he's taken pictures and, looked at both sides, what possible wildlife could be to live in these cat nine tails and things like that. And, making guesses and not having to go out there and actually see that spotted salamander or whatever. But, he's done an excellent job of mapping this all out for the culverts that he's had to work on. And, I was going to try and see if I could get to this, to the New Hampshire Aquatic Restoration Mapper. And if I can, and I can figure out how it works, I was gonna share it with him and then see, so that he can go on there and look and see what you guys have on the culverts that he's worked, and see how that matches up with the work that he's done.
Yeah.
So I was trying to get him interested in this again, so that he'll, not that he's not interested, because he replaces a culvert like, every other week. Something breaks. But so it's like, I think that between his database and yours, that there might be some things that he might be able to add to them.
Absolutely.
Instead of, because when you think about it, this whole idea about mapping all of these out, what you want to make that is a living document. So that you know when somebody invested a huge amount of money to replace something, oh, this guy's been replaced, what did they replace it with, what's it look like now?
Yeah.
You know, things like that.
That's kind of the,
Kind of the goal, I would think, is to keep
Yeah.
this data, you know, continuing to accumulate.
because each town, like you're saying, usually has someone who's
Who's done some of
very
this.
familiar with.
Yeah. Oh, he's familiar with the 162 or 200 of them that he's already done.
Yeah.
And he goes, and I know that ain't all. You know, that he hasn't, since 2016, there's been quite a few culverts that have just done what they were supposed to do, so he hasn't looked at them
Yeah.
yet.
And it's kind of difficult. I think we're gradually trying to work towards a statewide knowledge of which culverts are actually being replaced, because it's usually just on a town
Yeah,
level.
and
So-
wouldn't that be nice?
Looking through hazard mitigation plans is sometimes helpful, but there's no real systematic way to
Yeah,
which culverts.
like our
are
hazard
replaced and when.
mitigation plan says which culverts we're interested in replacing,
Yeah.
but it's a static document.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't get touched until the next time Henry comes to town and we have to do it over again.
Yeah.
Just every 5 years for FEMA.
Yeah.
But, yeah, the point is that there's data out there. I'm sure all of the municipalities have records of what they've done and things like that you might be interested in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would solve a lot of problems. Just being able to.
Like Walpole, for example, although on your first map, the one that, when we first came in here, that showed a lot of little yellow dots in Walpole.
Mhm.
It was just the fine detail one that didn't, so I was like.
Yeah, and that was just in the last 4 years, and it was a little confusing because that was just from 2021 to 2024, the
Yeah.
recent culvert assessments that have been done. So maybe since
Yeah.
if there was assessments done in 2017, then that would have showed up there,
Yeah.
but maybe it's outdated at this point anyway. So
Well, thank you for this. This was-
yeah, thank you.
I did
No, I
good information.
appreciate it.
Glad to see that somebody's looking at it on state level.
Yeah. Like, I think there is quite a bit of enthusiasm for trying to solve these problems.
Well, I hope you continue to get funded.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Brian. We have 9 more minutes. So if there are other questions for Brian, feel free to shoot those his way. We can also open up the floor to partner updates if folks have anything they want to share. What's been going on.
Or we could leave early.
We can also leave early.
It's really nice out there.
Sure, yeah, if there are no more questions for Brian. Oh, Terry's got his hand raised. Looks like you're muted, Terry. Oh,
Yep, there you go. Going forward, I want to go back to Marge's concern about these events happening more often. And the way the weather is happening now, it seems as though it's increasing at a faster pace than it ever has before. So are we starting to plan on very extreme weather events? And that might be snowballing here in the next 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, because we may have reached a critical climate stage here where things might be really starting to get out of control big time. Is that something that you're thinking about?
Yeah, that's certainly being considered. Like I mentioned, there's, at least for the coastal program, there's kind of a mandate to add 15% to basically the normal precipitation predictions that have been established. Just as kind of like a blanket cover to better anticipate the increased rain that's coming and is already here. But yeah, that's been sort of an echoed concern from a lot of different groups, and I think that's something that we're trying to figure out how to deal with. But obviously, with more rain comes higher design standards, and who knows at what point the threshold's crossed where it might be cost prohibitive. But that's certainly, I mean, yeah, in an ideal scenario where we're designing these crossings to be resilient to basically anything that gets thrown at it. So, yeah, I'll definitely relay those concerns because other groups have talked about that, and I've kind of considered talking to the modelers of that hydraulic vulnerability model that we've used, and trying to take maybe the higher confidence levels for those precipitation events rather than the normal levels. So just any way that we can try to better anticipate higher levels of precipitation and higher intensity levels. Yeah.
Well, question about this 100-year storm, who is the one that, or what criteria designates that? And I assume it's gonna have to increase, but who's responsible for coming up with those thresholds?
So I guess there's FEMA, which has the 100-year floodplain. But the data inputs that go into the hydraulic vulnerability model that we're using, with those various storm intervals, it's, I believe, the Cornell Extreme Precipitation Lab. So they have a pretty good website where you can basically find all the numbers. You can click on a point on a map, and they try to predict as best as they can what level of precipitation would occur at that given storm interval. So I don't know exactly what's going into their model, but
Yes, in Ringe 10 years ago, the Conservation Commission put in one of those concrete precast arches for access to one of our managed properties. And we had the engineers calculated the 100-year storm based on the floodplain. Well, it was the Wapak Trail, which when you started out talking about the local contours are pretty abrupt in places. And so between the watershed that fed this stream, the Miller's River actually, was the whole Wapak Ridge. And so he had a standard calculation for the area and this change of elevation. But what happened was we had it done in the fall, and the very next spring, the whole arch moved downstream 3 feet. Because it was a cascade effect, and we actually had a 1 in 500-year storm. There was a lot of beaver ponds in between, and one broke, and everybody was already saturated. So the first one knocked the second one, and we had 5 in a row. So it was a wall of water that came down. It was, like a storm surge they talk about. It was just a natural river.
yeah.
And so we had to redo the foundation. We survived, but we had to re-engineer the whole thing. But it was planned for a 100-year storm, and it didn't even last a year.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, beaver dams have a certain 20-year history,
Yeah.
so they must have all been built at the same time and they all rotted out at the same time. And
but it was also a lot of rain in that spring and at the time. So everything was primed for the worst case.
Yeah, there are so many factors that it's hard to figure out the local conditions. And I think a lot of those storm intervals and the precipitation events for like 100-year, 500-year, it's definitely a rough estimate because, like you said, there could be factors that don't go
It
into those
wasn't your
numbers.
standard calculation.
Yeah, absolutely.
The exact same thing happened to Ackworth. That's one town over from Elstead, where they took out a $2.1 million note to rebuild Camp Brook Road, the one that was shown up there. They put a brand new box culvert in there, and the flood of 2023, they didn't get that culvert in there until 2022. In 2023, the flood wiped out that thing again, and they were like, there's $2.1 million that we spent in taxes, and now this thing's useless to us.
That's disheartening.
No,
Yeah.
it was, not only did it come out, it broke, and so they can't even use it again. And it was like, it didn't even, like you said, it lasted maybe a year. And to this day, here it is the end of 2024, Camp Brook Road's still closed. Can't drive it. There's only one way into Bascom's now, Bascom's is the big maple sugaring place up in Ackworth. And there's only one road that goes in there now, or two. There's only one now.
It would be interesting, I've not heard of the Cornell mapping, be interesting to have the 100-year plan and what the Cornell, do they have mapping similar to that?
For flood maps?
Yeah.
No,
I
I
would
think
think
it's more
It's
just,
more- yeah.
they'll spit out numbers, for precipitation levels, so they might predict for a certain point, on a map,
Yeah,
for a 100-year storm, it would predict that would be 5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period or something like that.
oh,
And that would be, so
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
what they're mapping, and then,
And I think that you can see it's getting not better, but worse. Because like, they didn't have a lot of advanced warning in North Carolina and Western North Carolina about what was about to happen to them.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, in Florida, they did, I have a friend that lives down in Tampa and he was already told to get out before, Helene came in.
Mhm.
But they didn't get that kind of warning in Western North Carolina because they didn't know. They didn't realize how
What-
much rain was gonna be
what
coming.
kind of culvert? Even state-of-the-art box culvert,
And that wasn't
What
gonna
is it?
stand
How
up to
many
any of that.
inches an hour? How,
Yeah, it was a horrible number. It was like 30 inches in 4 hours or something. It was like, there isn't a place in the country that can stand up to that.
No.
I mean, Niagara Falls would have had trouble with that, but it's like, yeah, you just can't predict this, and that happened so fast. And look at how many people died. Because they didn't get the warning to get out.
The answer to some of this, of course, is we need to cut back on fossil fuel use and not be subsidizing or rewarding companies that are doing new drilling and new mining.
Yeah, I mean, people have been screaming that this is coming for, I don't know how many years,
About
and
50.
it seems to be here now.
Can I make a plug for the local energy solutions, conference? In line with what you're talking about, that's on November 1st, and that, if you're interested in that. That's a solution from the energy perspective.
Where's that being held?
That's in Manchester.
Oh, in Manchester.
Soon, right?
Yes, November 1st.
You get a ticket for that? Thank you.
You can register, yes, online, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.
thank you, Jason, for setting this up.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining, everybody. Thanks for listening.
It's,
Yeah.
education.
I'll look into that.
Oh, motion to adjourn?
See if I can
Well, I've had to.
figure out.
Yes.
Can-
But,